Welcome panel speakers, organizers and audience to this second panel in the new ACES series on Decolonizing Europe. My name is Tasneem Anwar. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. And together with Dr. Robbie Shilliam, we co-organized this series with the Amsterdam Center for European Studies on Decolonizing Europe. So first, a few words about the series. So we kicked off the series last week with the first event on Wednesday with a great panel on decentering Europe with Professor Gurminder Bamra and Dr. Darshan Vigneswaran. So the panelists discussed the insights from decolonial and postcolonial literature to unpack some of the Eurocentric nature of concepts that we use in international relations and political science, such as modernity, universality. And both speakers also elaborated on the possibilities of rethinking Europe's place in the world by taking the colonial nature of world politics as a starting point rather than, for example, Eurocentric concepts like modernity. And also re-examining world politics through alternative historical moments like the Haitian Revolution, one of the examples that Professor Bamra gave. And so today we're building upon this first panel, but we turn our gaze slightly inwards into academia and our own knowledge production through the question, who gets to speak? So during this panel, we really focus on race and racism in our knowledge productions, and we do so in two ways. So on the one hand, we will speak about the importance of taking race and racism as central concept to discuss and analyze international politics, and also the silencing and neglect that is part of the structure of academia. And building up upon that, we also discussed the exclusion of certain voices in academia, relating it to the current events around Black Lives Matter, specifically talking about the racist structures in academia and society and anti-Black sentiments also existing in academia. So we're very honored and happy to have two distinguished scholars with us today. Talking about these important topics, talking about decolonizing knowledge production. And I'm very proud to introduce to you Professor Robbie Shilliam. He's Professor of International Relations at the Hopkins University, and Dr. Nivi Manchanda, Senior Lecturer or Associate Professor in International Politics at Queen Mary University in London. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today in this panel. So I'm just going to kick it right off with our first topic and introduce a little bit also of your work on race and racism in international relations. Talking about the book that you edited, Confronting the Global Color Line. And I think the work is really great. Your work focuses on addressing questions of race and racism in theory and knowledge production. Just wanted to, as an introductory question, put this on the table. So can you speak a little bit on how does racism and the dismissal, especially of the importance of race as a central concept in IR, impact theories and knowledge within Europe and IR specifically, but also in academia more broadly? And I would like to give the floor first to Nivi to answer this question, and then pass it on to Robbie, and we can have a conversation. Nivi, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me. So that's a quite important question, and my sense is that, like you say, it's not so much a dismissal of race, but rather its diminution or marginalization that has impacted theories in IR and in academia more broadly. We've seen in many works now that race and racism have been integral to the founding of the discipline, from the establishment of the Woodrow Wilson Chair in Aberystwyth in 1919 in international politics, to the first journal, which is called the Journal of Race Development in 1910, which then became Foreign Affairs. Wilson oversaw racial segregation in the United States and promoted what might be called paternal imperialism abroad, and much of international relations at the time was a matter of sorting out imperial administration and that in itself was an intrinsically racialized endeavor. So race and racism has been at the heart of the discipline from the outset, but then it gets relegated to the sidelines as a more sort of positivist disciplinary field begins to take hold. In terms of acknowledging racism in European IR theory, I think we should really begin by acknowledging racism in Europe at large. And I think this entails a more honest conversation about genocide, enslavement, and colonialism historically, and then the institutionalized structures of racism that live on in their aftermath or in their wake. This affects society, the university, and the theories people in universities that people devise and then employ. So perhaps the start of this conversation might be opening up a conversation about redress and reparations politically, and then reparative readings and theory in IR. We had some of this in the book that Robbie and I and Alex edited, but since then actually lots more work has been done. So I feel like the terrain is shifting, and it now is quite a fecund time to have those conversations about race and racism, not least in the aftermath of May the 25th and the brutal murder of George Floyd. Thank you.
Thank you, Nivi. Robbie, would you like to elaborate and respond?
Yeah, so I think going on from what Nivi was just saying, there's an interesting moment in the post World War II era, especially during the Cold War, where there is a global movement for liberation, decolonization, which also links to freedom struggles in the West. And at that moment in time, especially in political science and in IR, the study of imperialism, racism, and as Nivi was saying, kind of reparation movements, kind of gets waylaid and in theoretical terms. So, for example, one has in IR the rise of abstract theorizing about international relations. You know, things to do with the rise of Kenneth Waltz, abstract theories of anarchy, levels of analysis, all that kind of stuff, right? And at the same time, there's a separating out of what is called area studies from IR. So substantive struggles over global order are divorced from the building of a theoretical canon, right, which is now taught in university as if it's kind of always been there. But this is a Cold War thing, right? So that's the first thing to say, right? Is that the what we call IR theory is not necessarily racist per se in terms of its intention, but structurally it's a result of separating out the real existing struggles and ideas about those struggles from the production of a theoretical corpus. Okay. And you can see that also in political science. So Charles Mills has done a little bit of work on this. If you think about at the end of Vietnam, the end of the Vietnam War, all questions about global justice become passed through a John Rawls style, veil of ignorance, which produces the dominant mode of theorizing in political theory today, which is analytical philosophy, right? At the same time, Mrs. Mills' point, at the same time as people struggling against the legacies of empire and new militarized imperial moves, not just from the West, by the way, but also from the communist world. At that point in time, Rawls invites us to basically say, forget the world, let's have a veil of ignorance over the world and just take some ideal positions and, what would justice reasonably look like. So you have to think, well, why is he saying that? in the moment when actually people are telling him what justice looks like in the world. And political science has never really recovered from that moment. And part of that, and I'll finish here, part of that is to do with the association and conflation of good theorizing with abstraction, right? That's really important. And that's why it's difficult it's an uphill struggle to say that that race and racism is something which is foundational to the world order and should be theorized, as well as linking that to not simply the presence of people of color in the academy, but also the ways in which the academy is implicated in, you know, racialized structures of inequality in the world. So really, that's the thing that I would want to say, that there's something that happens in the 60s and the 70s, which is very pernicious structurally, and it also sets the bounds as to what we think good theorizing is in political science.
Yeah, thank you, Robbie, for this important point, and Nivi as well. And I think, Nivi, you also mentioned this in one of your work, that IR has become so focused on theory building rather than doing, you know, the descriptive or historical analysis, in which a lot of the let's say mainstream theories or concept will easily be complicated if you look at, you know, the historical context in which they have been emerging and used. So maybe building up on this, you know, moving the discussion a little bit onwards, because what something that I really appreciated in the introduction of your book, where you describe how Kenneth Bowles, and you briefly just mentioned him, Robbie, as a key IR theorist, also cites Lenin rather than W.E.B. Du Bois, who is an African-American sociologist, developed the color line as an analytical tool to understand world politics, and also, for example, the causes leading up to World War I, as you described. And he really centers racism and race as a concept in IR. Yet in citing Lenin, I think it raises a really important point about an important aspect of knowledge productions, which is the politics of citation. So I would like to turn to this topic and ask you to reflect also on the importance of the politics of citation, whose work gets cited, becomes visible, especially maybe historically, but also contemporary in the referencing of Black scholars, people of color, women of color, who work on race and their intersections in academia. Robbie, could you kick us off this time?
Ooh, okay. Well, I mean, you know, Lenin had some interesting things to say about colonialism and all that. Let's just, you know, make that point, which many people in the 20th century found interesting, right? But the citation issue remains, right? And much of this is to do with, I would say, or let me build on it from what I said before, and then Nivi can take it in another direction, maybe. And it's to do with this thing about abstraction, right? So, firstly, one might have terms which I'm sure you guys talked about last week, like modernity, right? Or even like capitalism, which are presumed to have an abstract, therefore universal purchase, right? In other words, if you talk about capitalism in the contemporary world or historically, immediately you're talking about humanity. You're talking about global structures. You know, you're talking about abstract principles which help us to explain the world. If you talk about race and slavery, now suddenly you're being particular, right? Well, slavery only happened to some people. Well, racism, you know, is one thing of many things, and, you know, I am or I am not a racist, right? Or racist, well, that's the black problem. You know, it's not the human problem. It's like, it's the Jewish problem. It's not the human problem, right? So there's a particularization and partialization which happens with concepts and arguments and literatures which take empire and colonialism as their departure points. And when you take empire and colonialism as your departure point, you have to, in some way, shape or form, although that can be very different in different ways, you have to take race as one of the structuring principles. So that's the first thing, right? It's about which histories, which concepts, which practices get automatically accorded with a universality, right, which then can be which then can be appropriately theorized about, and which ones are seen as partial. And that's all to do with what Sartre, Richard Wright, all these boys were talking about when they said, well, there is a difference between asking about the Negro problem and asking about anti-black racism. There's a difference about talking about the Jewish problem and talking about anti-Semitism. There's a difference, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing then is to do with who you can imagine to have salient knowledge, such that where they're coming from and their experiences and even what they look like doesn't really matter. And in many ways, political theory it has a real problem with this. And I understand it, because in part political theorists are trained to say, well, look, we can answer. They're like philosophers, man. I can answer any question. Oh, I'm not an expert on Malawi, but you know, with my theoretical corpus of Foucault and Kant and blah blah blah, I can tell you anything you want to know about governmentality in Malawi, right, or natural rights or what have you, right? This is not their fault. This is how they're trained, and this is what the kind of conceit of political theory gives. We can explain everything, and we don't really need to know anything that empirical, but we can tell you something interesting about it. Now, imagine that you tell them that, well, your boy Kant, you know, is very, very clever, but he only left Königsberg a couple of times, and that was only to the surrounding area, right? Why does that make him someone who is automatically universalizable? And we can talk about the perpetual peace for humanity. Whereas you talk about people, other theorists, right, who have been trotting the whole world, people like Claudia Jones, Amy Ashwood Garvey, and they have theories and they are theorizing, but they are perceived to be of only partial interest or provincial interest, because they are black women apparently talking about black women things, right? Why was Kant not a white European in East Germany, in East Prussia, talking about East Prussian white man things? Do you get what I'm saying? So this is basically, you know, the starting point is the principle about who is able to generate knowledge which is salient for the human condition. That's the citation thing, but I know Nevi will take it somewhere else.
Thanks. That actually kind of ties in with some of the things I'd like to say. So the first thing is about Du Bois. Du Bois himself had to do a lot of work to justify himself as a source of knowledge. And Saidiya Hartman's latest book on Wayward Lives talks about Du Bois being, you know, the right kind of black man. So he spoke the language of science, and he dressed a certain way, and so even within, Du Bois does great work, and his work on the Colonial is absolutely critical. But even within that, there is already a political economy to knowledge production, and people of color and black people have to perform that even more than a white person. The other thing, while Robbie was speaking, I was thinking about this, was when I wanted to do a PhD on Afghanistan. I'm not Afghan, hadn't been there, I don't speak the language. Nobody questioned, I was at Cambridge, so nobody questioned my sort of expertise, even though I was a student who was just kind of interested in doing work on Afghanistan. When I recently did a grant application and I wanted to look at race and racism in Britain, 2 of the 3 reviewers were saying, oh, well, what does she know about Britain? I'm speaking the language, I've lived here all my adult life. Her work is in Afghanistan. So what, you know, how can she suddenly shift gear? So it was totally legitimate for me to be studying something and somewhere quite distant, because it was over there. But I had to already have this corpus of knowledge before I even started on a project looking at Britain. So those kinds of things are built in. The other thing about the politics of citation is that actually I think it's hugely important, and I wish I'd spent more time thinking about this while I was doing a PhD. I was writing about colonialism, but many of the people I cited were white men. And now it's regrettable, not because I think their work is no good, but because there is a tautology to the politics of citation. The more somebody is in circulation, the more they're cited. Some of this is because academia remains largely a white field. There's definitely a gender dimension to this. We know women are likely to do more PhDs in the humanities, but far less likely to become professors. And then there's also this north-south element, right? So the ways in which knowledge is produced, packaged, and marketized. A lot of good work from people of color based in the global south is never published. And this is for a host of reasons. The lack of institutional resources, the capacity to disseminate work, but also discriminatory practices of academic journals and publishers themselves. And this doesn't have to be explicit or even intended, and I've seen this in my own experience of editing journals, that sometimes we're just unable to accept very good articles by people whose first language is not English, whose syntax is not all there, even when we recognize that the work itself is very good. And so that's a structural issue, and there are endeavors to change that, but journals and academic publishing in general tend to be gatekeepers of academic practice, and then that tends in turn to be a racialized sort of, even if not intended or willfully racialized practice. But then there's loads of other things that, you know, we need to kind of be cognizant of. So for instance, some of the difficulties in these endeavors are like, not all people of color are interested in decolonizing the curriculum or working on race. And also there is some hostility and pushback against people who've suddenly become interested in race and in publishing or working up syllabi on something that they've largely overlooked. And we've been having these conversations in a lot of spaces. And on the one hand, you can view this as a negative development because a lot of the labor falls on people of color and there's no attendant recognition and sometimes even erasure of those people. But on the whole, I think that this is still a positive development, because having more text on race and racism, and especially having more sort of courses and syllabi that deal with these things and that bring this to the table and open up the conversation for students, is, on the whole, I would argue, a good thing. But these are still quite knotty and complicated questions, right? But yeah, but the politics of citation, again, is absolutely key. And I think we should all be citing the rich archive of work that exists, and that is just pushed to the sides.
Can I just add something to that, Tasmi? Because I think Nivi's really on it when she talks about the complexity of it, and that is very fractal. There's power and exclusions within power and within exclusions, right? So for instance, you know, the most cited people, even if they're not white men, are going to be Anglophones, right? They're going to be, like Nivi said, they're going to be speaking and writing in the English language. More than that, they're going to be in the American Academy, right? Which is itself a very insular academy, right? Then they might be in the UK Academy, Australia maybe. Do you get what I mean? So even before you get to the global south, there are already all these, you know, nestings of inequalities and exclusions, right? And then that also pertains to particular fields of study, which gets back to what we were talking about before. So for example, post-colonial scholars rarely cite Black studies, right? And now, why is that? Do you get what I mean? Even I can tell you, the Caribbean literature is preferred in the Western Academy more than Pacific literature. So certain islands, you know what I mean? It's terrible, right? But certain islands seem to be closer than other islands, right? And there's all arguments you can make. I mean, political economy arguments, psychoanalytical arguments you can make about why that is the case, right? So when we talk about these politics of citation, like Nivi said, we can never rest. Do you get what I'm saying? You know, we're never the good guys, whoever we are. You know, we're always having to think very carefully about who it is that we're centering and who, or more precisely, who is it that we're not thinking of.
Yeah, thank you both for these great contribution. And I really think that stressing the complexity also of this all is so important, especially because to go on this path of decolonizing and to take it seriously also means accepting indeed this responsibility that there will, within our limits, there will be there's a great possibility that we will still overlook and that we will still silence, and to be attentive also to this and the complexities, and maybe be a bit modest also in our attempts, and to stay always modest and curious about what's out there and what we can still learn, I think is a very important message. So thank you so much for sharing that. And especially Nivi already mentioned some things that go beyond the politics of citation, but point to more structural or institutional forms of exclusion and racism in academia. And I think also one of the inspirations for the topic of this specific panel was the hashtag that was on Twitter, Black in the Ivory. And it was about scholars sharing their experience with racism, specifically anti-Black racism in academia. And even though it focused, I think initially on the US context, it also is very relevant, I think, for European context, the UK context. And so just wanting to broaden up the question from the politics of citation to broader institutional forms of racism and exclusion. Robbie, you also mentioned the language barrier as one of these examples, and I think it's really important to be attentive to this, but also to take it a step further and pose to you the question, what does it mean? Like, what does then our limited, so to say, knowledge production, what kind of effects does it have on society, on people's, what is our responsibility in that sense as academia and the knowledge that we produce, knowing these institutional forms of exclusion? Nifi, can I give the floor to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So just wanted to remind that the Q&A box is still open to the audience. So if you have any questions in between, please feel free to drop them so we can use them later on for the Q&A. Sorry for interrupting, Nivi.
No, thanks. Yeah. So I think I've been following Black in the hashtag Black in the Ivory, and the stories are truly horrific. But one of the other things that stood out is that there are actually far more Black voices in the US than there are in the UK, and I would imagine in continental Europe. So even on that front, Europe is a little bit behind that conversation. But also when it comes to sort of racist structures in academia, I think that my overwhelming sense is that there aren't really any anti-racist structures, right, in academia, like not structurally, not built in. And again, somebody posted on Twitter saying that if sometimes when you think about the anti-racist version of something, the obvious answer is it's abolition. I'm not agitating for the abolition of the university, but I am, like, I've been trying to grapple with that question, like, is an anti-racist university possible? And I guess my cautiously optimistic answer is yes. But I think it would have to be more than just an acknowledgement of racism. And there would have to be some reckoning, like Robbie says, of our own complicity in the structures of oppression, but then also how those structures keep changing. So we have to be sort of alive to the fact that it's not just enough to add, for instance, people of color into a reading list, and also how, for instance, if we're talking about racism, that's not exactly a flat thing. So South Asian communities, of which I'm a part, have their own form of very visceral anti-Blackness, for instance. So those structures themselves are not all the same, and we have to kind of keep fighting for, or being aware of, but also fight for what we, for what an actually anti-racist thing in university might look like. And I think Stefan O'Harney and Fred Moten have argued in their work on the fugitive university that we don't have to be for or against the university, but we have to use and often divert the resources we have at our disposal to cede space when it's needed, to refuse to subvert, to collaborate, even if it doesn't lead to large grants, and in general to engage in a politics of solidarity. The other thing is that we all need to sign up to this endeavor to, like, decolonize, even if I'm using a sort of problematic term and I recognize the limits, because an egalitarian and just university is not something that's simply beneficial to students or the minoritized staff, but that racialized and gendered and other hierarchies harm all of us. So this is not an attempt to sort of wish away the ways in which racism affects different people disproportionately, but that white supremacy is toxic for white people, just as patriarchy and misogyny is bad and detrimental for men. And so a university that can deal with that is actually just a better university, even on its own terms. I have more to say, but I'll stop there.
I could pick up on a couple of things that Nivi was saying, and I think there's levels to this, right? And there are radically different experiences depending on where you are, where you work, what position you have when you work, and you know what your kind of intersectional being is, so to speak, right? And most of those replies on that Black in the Ivory Tower are kind of sanitized, right? That said, we always want to think about this question in terms of a political economy, and that's where Nivi, I think, started as well, right? So, you know, Nivi, like if you think about who are the cleaning staff, who are the security staff at your university, you know exactly what they look like, right? And that's the same in many, many universities, right? The lowest paid, the most contingent, the worst working conditions and all that. And we cannot think about these questions absent of the wider economy and ecology within which these universities operate. And even if they're non-profit, the very fact that they're all trying to grow their student base means that they necessarily gentrify the areas surrounding them. You get what I mean? So there are all these spillover effects, which we absolutely cannot divorce any of these questions from, you know, even before we start to look to the bigger issues about global justice and reparation, you know, all that kind of stuff, right? And I also think that links into students as well, right? So yes, there are some privileged and very elite students, and no, many students are not that, right? I mean, the most egregious things I can remember happening to my students when I was working in London, where Nivi works. What happened to Muslim students? That happened to Muslim students, and counter-terrorism went round at least one of my students' houses and bashed up the house and took away his passport, because another couple of students phoned him in and said that he was Daesh, right? So that's another part of it, right? That and especially if you think about all the conversations we're having in the US at the moment about policing, and you know how many campuses have armed police, and how that then brings certain racialized dynamics of violence onto the campus, so that certain people can't escape the rest of the world when they come onto the campus, right? So all of these are part of this larger question about decolonizing the university, and of course reparation doesn't mean, abolition doesn't mean to get rid of, right? What it means is, how can we envisage, for example, public safety without a racist police force? Right? Can we envisage higher education without its colonial and racist hierarchies? You know, and from that and to prefigure that vision, right? So that's really where I would say we are.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I couldn't agree more, especially because, you know, to adopt this kind of vocabulary of abolition and decolonizing really moves beyond, I think, the current attempts of the diversity initiatives that usually, unfortunately, result into indeed adding more people of color, and then, you know, looking nice on the picture, but then not really addressing some of the fundamental issues and structural processes of exclusion. So, but I do want to end yeah, finalize this conversation a little bit on an idealistic note, if that's okay with you, and to invite you to think with me, how can we then envision a theory of IR that starts with this acknowledgement of racism, of its complicity in oppression, and how could IR then look like if we use race and racism as central concepts, just like sovereignty or anarchy are central concepts to the theory of IR, and how would it change the discipline? So to kind of envision this from this position. Nivi, could you kick us off again?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, just what Robbie was saying, really, some of the stuff he said earlier about IR, and I don't think IR necessarily needs a new theory. I think it needs to engage with the rich archive of work that already exists, and we know that Claudia Jones, for instance, and Amy Garvey have done some of that work that isn't considered IR. So this is more than an acknowledgement of racism and its intersections, but it's piecing together another narrative, not necessarily a new narrative, but that one draws on the work of theorists who are rarely ever given that status. And Robbie's co-edited volume on Bandung does some of this work. Ada Mgatuju's new book on world making has also done this like important task of archiving and distilling. I think there's a lot more out there to be mined, not so that IR can present itself on trend, but because that reflection and that reckoning will be more reflective of and sensitive to the problems facing the contemporary world, the world that IR purports to study, right? And we just know that realism, for instance, is not actually up to the task. It doesn't help us make sense of the world in the face of a pandemic, the most global event of our times. IR theory doesn't help us. We can't give it to students, not the IR theory we normally do. When people of color and Black people are dying disproportionately and the virus is ravaging poor communities, we need something that is more, I would say, ontologically, epistemologically, but also politically useful than IR. And I think in this, the activists are ahead of us, as in many other things. And there's a conversation that's ongoing, that's important, and IR really just needs to plug into it rather than come up with another theory that's just going to be cast aside.
I mean, I guess I would say, you know, what IR suffers from is pretty much what social science suffers from, and to start to prefigure that differently would be to start with research with a different premise, and the premise would be something along the lines of presume that those peoples who have had structural violence done unto them have traditions of thought, inquiry, and practice which explain that violence, which allow for mitigation of that violence and even for repair of that violence. And then imagine that the whole world is like that.
Yeah, thank you both so much for this. We have some questions from the audience that I would like to pose to you. So I'm just reading out this question for Robbie by Dr. Polly Pallister-Wilkins. And she asks, I was hoping Robbie, based on his previous work and having worked in Aotearoa, New Zealand, if he could expand on the diminution of the Pacific in discussions about colonialism. Robbie, could you take this one up?
Well, briefly, I guess. So it's the biggest feature on the planet. If aliens came to well, if they're already here, maybe, but anyway, let's pretend that they're not here. So if they came to Earth, right, you know, what would capture their attention most would be the Pacific. It's the biggest geographical feature on the Earth, right? The Pacific is also the place where not only very influential theories of exchange, of subjectivity, of modernity come from, and I'm especially talking about Marcel Mauss and Claude Levi-Strauss and this whole development of a particular kind of social anthropology, right? Which all take Maori and other South Pacific cosmologies and terms to heart and try to theorize the modern condition from it. But also, quite simply, it was the proving ground, the test bed and the proving ground of the greatest military force there has ever been in the world, which is the US and the US Navy. Not only that, but of course it was also the site of nuclear testing, not only in war with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but immediately after war in Bikini Atoll, and all around the place, right? So it is essentially important. However, it was never that important to European colonial powers. And so when we do our post-colonial stuff through the prism of what was important to European colonial powers, that's when we start to miss certain things.
Thank you so much. I have a question that is, I think, addressed to the both of you, but I'm going to pose it first to Nivi, and that's a question by Nora Fisher-Honor. And she asks a question about bridging critical race studies and post-colonial IR. How does one navigate the American centrism of much work on race?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And, you know, I've also grappled with that, not necessarily just, well, so my sense is that a lot of the work on critical race theory and racism is American-centric, but then a lot of work on British colonialism is British, right? And that they seem to be the sort of big cannons that we navigate. My sense, and this is just a very sort of cursory sense, is that there's loads of people who have done that work, and again, it just takes a little bit of time to go into libraries and archives and start doing that work. But also that, as somebody who works in post-colonial theory, some of the most important conversations are being had not at the level of what we consider theory, right? So in India, the conversations about caste, which I think are actually quite key to post-colonial theory, and are being had by being made by Dalit activists themselves, and they're so effectively shut down at that stage that then they never become sort of canonized or even available literature. So some of that needs to be actually engaging with the communities and those concerns, and at quite local levels. But then that obviously there's a problem of abstraction. And if you do want to talk about, make grand claims about these things, and racism is a structure, those claims are also important. There is some tension in that, but I just think it's a good question, and I'd be very happy to hear what other people have to say about this too. And Robbie obviously will know more because he's been situated in some of those than I have. So yeah.
No, I mean, all I would say, building on that, and I think your thing about caste is really important, is that we're constantly rescripting these bodies of thought and literature, right? And in doing so, we're constantly separating them, right? So Nico Slate wrote a great book on the way in which debates and struggles over caste in India have always been linked in tense ways often, but nonetheless linked to struggles over racism and in the US. So Cedric Robinson, when he wrote Black Marxism, he wrote part of it in a little town in Sussex, in the county of Sussex, just south of where Nivi works now, right? And much of his ideas were were influenced by his conversations with the British Institute of Race Relations, which, you know, had a whole Commonwealth kind of vista rather than a national vista. So these connections are all there.
Nivea, I have a clarifying question for you, if you wouldn't mind answering it in between. There's a question from someone in the audience wondering what it meant when you said that decolonization in itself is problematic. I might have an idea just from my background in social anthropology, but I'm curious about your take on it.
Oh, yeah, I was talking about the fact that, as Jan and Tuck have written in their piece, decolonization is not a metaphor, that the term is actually tethered to questions about land rights and getting space back, and, you know, in the context especially of settler colonialism in the United States and in Canada, that to use decolonization metaphorically is problematic, and there is a lineage that we need to recognize there. That's simply all I meant when I said that the term is problematic. The other thing is also the fact that decolonization is now being used and just sort of bandied about, even to refer to sort of diversity exercises. So you throw in a couple of people of color on your reading list and you decolonize the curriculum, and that is so in practice even there's problems. So that's kind of what I meant.
Yeah, thank you for that. I hope you don't mind taking up the next question as well, because I'm not sure if Robbie is still in connection with us, but we have an interesting question from Yazid Zahra.
Okay, Robbie's
yes.
there. Robbie, your video seems stuck, but I think you're there.
I don't know what's going on. Sorry, guys.
No problem at all. We're happy that you're here with us. So I have this question that goes into something that you mentioned, Robbie, by Yazid Zahda, who asked, given your very critical view of academic research carried out with such Eurocentric approach towards social sciences, how much do you then find area studies by scholars who do not speak the language and have little knowledge of the culture reliable?
I'm finding it slightly difficult to unpack the question, so I apologize, but is this about how area studies is in itself Eurocentric, or that the fact that people study areas that they don't have the language to be able to, yeah.
I think my understanding of the question is indeed about area studies that then particularly focus on areas, but by scholars who go, for example, on fieldwork, not speaking the language or not being able to put the empirical findings that they have in the right cultural context. And maybe this in relation to how social sciences deal with this?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that even if you do have the language, you could still be propounding quite Eurocentric myths or ideas. And one of the things that this kind of tacks back to is, for instance, the human terrain stuff, where American anthropologists were asked to go to Afghanistan and Iraq, and these anthropologists often did speak the language and did have sort of knowledge of local culture, but then that knowledge was used for military purposes and for imperial purposes, and sometimes led to those people's deaths or things like that. So I think I'm not saying all of area studies is implicated in that, but and the question of language is absolutely a key one. What sort of representations and discourses do we perpetuate if we don't even understand the literal language that is being spoken? That's definitely a problem, but I think it's more than just a problem of language. And I don't think 2 years studying Arabic would necessarily mean that the work that one then does in the field is any less Eurocentric or racialized, or yeah. Have we just lost our Robbie completely?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think, but we really, I mean, it's already great to have him, and I think it was also amazing that he can join us despite the time difference and family commitments that he had. So, but I'm afraid indeed we lost it. So maybe we can do a final question, and then we're already at the end of the conversation, if that's okay for you, Nivi.
Yeah, absolutely, sure.
I have an interesting question I have several questions dealing with how to incorporate postcolonial and decolonial studies and literature into the curriculum. And many of the questions, or some of the questions, are simply where to start. So maybe you could say something about this. Where can we begin to read up, learn more, and to decolonize the curriculum?
So I guess as students and people working on this, so scholars and students, there's loads of resources now being now available, and lots of open curricula and syllabi. So I know the University of Cambridge has done one recently, but there's also like specific reading lists, abolition reading lists, etc. in the United States. So that would be one like obvious place to start. The other thing is that there are quite a lot of networks that students, PhD students, and early career scholars can also become part of. So the working group that Robbie co-founded, which I'm currently, along with Lisa, Tilly, and Karam Nishanjulu, are conveners of, is called the British International Studies Association Colonial, Postcolonial, Decolonial Working Group, but it's not limited to British students or faculty rather, and people can join that, and we do have conversations about these things. There's also GDS, the Global Development section of ISA, so the International Studies Association. I know that both EISA and PSA are going to start or have started initiatives. So there's loads of places where these conversations are currently ongoing, and it's good to sort of plug into those. But also for people who are designing curricula, I think just reading up about some of this stuff is the first place to start, and to like deliberately and conscientiously read Black people, scholars, people of color, and people who have been in the field for a long time. That would be, I think, the first sort of incursion into any sort of decolonizing venture.
Yeah, thank you. I couldn't agree more, and some great recommendations. We will also specifically deal with this topic on decolonizing the curriculum in the 5th episode of this series. So for people in the audience who are interested in this, you can register for that event as well. Thank you, Nivi, for your great contribution on these questions and all the questions, really. We have come to the end of this panel conversation, and I cannot thank you enough for taking the time and sharing your insights and contributing to this discussion. And also, of course, to Robbie, who unfortunately we lost just before I could thank him, but the both of you had such amazing thoughts to share, and your work is really excellent on this topic. So also, I think for people in the audience who want to start reading up on this, the work by Nivi and Robbie is also a great place to start. So I want to thank you, Nivi, for sharing this. I also want to thank the audience for your engagement and your excellent questions. And a special thanks to the Amsterdam Center for European Studies in facilitating and supporting this webinar series. And in particular, many thanks to Gijs van der Starre, Lisa Silas, and Simon for supporting this particular lecture. So next we will have a third panel in this series on rethinking European Ottoman encounters through Islam, democracy, and capitalism, moderated by Dr. Beste Işleyen. So you can check it out, and please register for this panel or the other panels or the newsletter if you want to stay updated on our events. With this, we can conclude this online panel conversations. Thank you all again. Thank you, Nivi, so much for being here with us, and yeah, enjoy the great weather outside.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Bye.
Thank you.